Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. I am quite excited to start building our application. And in this section, we'll only focus on page number 1 of our photo wall app. The first thing I want to do is break this up into components, the same way we broke up the sample Facebook page in the last section into components. Clearly on top we have a title and a button. They both have distinct interfaces and have different responsibilities. So those can be both broken up into two components. And right below we have our photo wall component. And as for the component files inside of our project, we don't need the list component anymore. We'll be creating new components to match those of the photo wall project. You can go ahead and delete it if you want. I will create a new folder of playground where I'm going to drag the list component somewhere it will not be invoked anymore since we don't actually need it. I'm just going to leave it there as a reference. The title component we can still use since our photo wall application indeed does have a title. And you can also go ahead and leave the main component since our application indeed will have a main component which renders out subcomponents. Remember the compositional model. First, make sure to delete the import list since we're not going to be using it anymore, as well as the two instances to our list component. It doesn't exist anymore. And now clearly, our photo wall application has a title of photo wall, not to-dos. So instead of passing in a title of to-dos from our component instance, we'll pass in a title of photo wall, which will serve as the header. Make sure everything still works in your project, and indeed it does. There are no crashes, and obviously this does not look as pretty as how it does in the final version of the app, and that's why we need CSS. Now, if you're already familiar with CSS and you don't want to hear me ramble on about it, in the article right before this lecture, I've included the CSS code for this app that you can simply copy into your project. I'll show you where to copy it in just a second, and you can feel free to skip through the parts in the video where I talk about CSS. However, if you have never used CSS before, CSS simply describes how our React elements can be displayed. For example, we created this button with a React, but in CSS is where you specify the button's borders, padding, color, background images, etc. It's how you beautify the UI. So we're going to start off by creating a folder inside of source called styles, and inside of styles, create a new file called stylesheet.css. We'll make use of it momentarily. Now, if you decided to take the first route and just copy the CSS code, simply copy it into the file, and you can feel free to skip through the parts of the video where I explain it. But if you decided to take the second route and not copy the CSS file into your project, but write it all out from scratch with me, then the first thing to do is to create the link between the code that we'll write in the CSS file and the elements being rendered on the screen. So to do that, inside of index.js, simply import our file, import, and our style sheet is in the folder styles/stylesheet.css, the style sheet itself. And so by importing the style sheet, we're invoking the UI changes inside of the CSS file. And first off, we're going to specify the font size of our HTML to be 10 pixels. Font size 10 pixels. And I seem to have made the mistake of placing our styles folder outside of source, so make sure it is inside, otherwise it will not get invoked. And there you go. Now the default font size is 16 pixels. This should make our title then a bit smaller, and indeed it does. Now the goal is to modify the title of our page. The title is a header tag. And so to modify the header tag, first I'm going to start by putting this side by side with our code editor so that we can directly reflect the changes that we're declaring. Alright, and now our title is a header tag, clearly. So if I define a rule set for header tags inside of my style sheet, whatever UI declarations we specify in this h1 rule set will have a direct effect on our title. Let's first start off by giving the title a font of Billabong by writing font family Billabong. Billabong is the font that you see in the final version of our app. And clearly, this doesn't actually do anything. That's because Billabong is not installed, it's not a font that's installed on our machine, as would Helvetica, Arial, or Times New Roman. It's not a common font. We need to declare it ourselves. And the way to do that is to specify a font face, like so. Font face allows us to grab fonts from an online source. The font we want to declare is, of course, font family, Billabong. Forgot my semicolon here. Don't forget those. And we're going to grab this font from an online source. So set source equal to some URL. Now, the URL I placed inside of the article right before this video. I'm not going to type it all out. It's pretty long, so make sure to go to it and copy and paste it right here. Once you do, everything should work as normal. And so obviously this URL specifies a resource that contains the font data. By copying it, we can therefore assign the Billabong font to our header, and it gives us back a pretty cool font. Now I'm just going to minimize this so I have more space to work with, and we'll align the header tag to the middle of the screen by declaring text align center. The font size will be 13 rems. If you've worked with a rem before, 1 rem will simply equal the font size of our HTML element, 10 pixels. We're declaring 13 rems, so 130 pixels. At the moment, however, our title is a bit too thick, so give it a font weight with a numeric value of 100. So with font weight, the range goes from 100 to 900. 100 indicates very thin text, as you can see, whereas 900 is quite thick. You can try to go above 900. It won't make a difference since 900 is as far as it goes. Let's put it back to 100. I believe that's what works best. And we can specify a margin property as well, such that we have vertical margins of 2 rems. So top and bottom margins will have a thickness of 20 pixels, and we'll have horizontal margins of 0 thickness. Those will let them be. We can also bring the letters closer together by declaring a letter spacing of -1 pixels. If you want to spread the letters apart, you would make this a positive value, like so. Imagine this was 12. But we'll resort to just this being a negative. I believe that's what looks best. And we're going to give the title a color. You know what? Let's leave the color as black, but I'll declare it anyway for your reference. It should not make any changes. And there you have it. This is a great start. Now I know that I rushed through the CSS code, but please understand this is not a CSS course. I really want to try and keep the focus on React as much as I can, but at the same time, I cannot in good conscience just copy and paste code and tell you to go along with it. If you're a beginner and you're just starting off with web development, it can be pretty overwhelming, and that is why I'm going through it, but at the same time, I will not go through it extensively. What I really want to focus on in this video is beginning the setup of our photo wall component inside of our project, this photo wall. And so in the previous article, right before this video, I left you guys an array that I wanted you to copy and paste into your project right here inside of main.js. So make sure to copy it. And this array, as you can see, has 3 elements. Each element will have an ID, a description, and a link to an image. Just like in the last section how we used tasks to map out an array of list items, let me just go to it. And I'm going to put this back as being the maximum size. And just like we had an array of tasks to map out an array of list items, we'll map over this array of posts to create these 3 photo elements when we first load the app. In order to display this list of photos, we need a component that's going to receive and render all of these photos to our view. So inside of the components folder, we're going to create a new file called photowall.js. We're naming it photowall because what it's going to do is the photowall component will receive all of the posts that are going to be passed into it as props, and from these posts, create a wall of images of what you see right here. And as always, we're going to import React from React, as well as the component property. Let's not forget that. All right. And using the ES6 class syntax, we will declare a class photo wall, which extends the component class so that we're able to inherit the render method. Oh, misspelled that. And now the render method, remember, is used to specify the UI that the component should display on the screen. And so we'll start off with a div, an empty container tag, like so. And this div essentially will contain all of the UI elements that we want to display based on this array. So this div is what's going to contain the three photos, the three figures. So first off, make sure to export our photo wall component, export default photo wall, and access it inside of main.js by importing import photo wall from /the photo wall file itself. Inside of the render method, create a single instance of the photo wall component, photo wall, such that we want to display one title and one photo wall. We can ignore this button for now. We'll get to it once we implement the React router, which is in the next section. Now the container that we just created, it's going to be its own component, made up of subcomponents of photos. The way the architecture of this UI will go is that we'll obviously have the main component, which is what's going to pass everything over to our DOM, rendering all the subcomponents to the screen. Inside of the main component, we declared one instance of our title component, hence the title you saw, and it will also contain one instance of a photo wall component. The photo wall component will simply be a container which is going to hold many instances of a photo component, all the photos. All right, let's start implementing it. This photo wall component instance inside of main.js will first pass in the posts array as props. So simply pass in posts is equal to the array posts, which we can access in the component's class definition in our render method as this.props.posts. We're going to map over the array.map with the argument posts. And for each post that we're iterating through in the array, for each post, we want to generate a new photo. And so first we must create a new file called photo.js, which should be inside of our components folder. And as always, import React from React, as well as the component property. Don't forget that. And create a class photo which extends component. Call the render method. And now remember that for each post that we're looping through, that we're iterating through, we want to create a new instance of the photo component, and thereby render an array of photos from this array of objects that we're passing through to photo wall. And so for each post that we loop through, we're going to return a photo instance, like so. Remember what map is doing is that it's looping through the array, and for every post that we're iterating through, it's creating a new photo component instance. As a result, we're generating an array of photo component instances and rendering it. And for every single photo instance that we create, we have to pass in the post associated with that photo as props. So make sure to pass in the prop post equal to the post associated with the picture that we're iterating through. By passing every post as props, we can now access each one in the class definition right here by writing const post is equal to this.props.post. This referring to the component instance that's passing in the props, the photo component instance. So quick summary of what we're doing in case you're lost. Photo wall component instance passes in an array of posts, this.props.posts. we're mapping through that array to render out 3 photo component instances. And for every photo instance that is created from each post that we're iterating through, we're passing in props of the post associated to that photo that was just looped through. And now these photo instances that we're generating from the array of posts, we need to define how they will be displayed. We'll do that in their class definition. And now before doing anything, I'm just realizing that we forgot to export this photo component. And so we were not actually accessing it inside a photo wall. This was undefined the entire time. Make sure to import photo from our file. From ./photo. And now this is actually something that we can use. And so back to it, each photo will have a figure tag, which is denoted by the tag figure, closing tag. And a figure is typically self-contained content, which can contain an image, normally accompanied by a caption, which is appropriate since from the finished product, inside each figure, we're displaying a photo with a figure caption containing text. All right, and I just noticed this error that we have right here about the unique key prop. We already got this error before, and it's just that if you're ever displaying an array of elements, each element must have a unique key prop, and we're going to set that key prop equal to the index of the array that's being iterated through, which we can access as the second argument. We've already been through this error before, don't worry about it. And so, remember we're creating an instance of the photo wall component, and that photo wall component, because it's iterating through an array of 3 objects, it's going to generate 3 photos, 3 photo component instances, and every photo instance is going to have a figure tag. As the app reruns, obviously these 3 figures do not show up because they don't contain anything, they're empty. And so before assigning them any images for each figure, we'll first modify their UI inside of our CSS. We'll start off by modifying the div that's containing our figures. And so inside of our style sheet, we're going to declare a class selector photo grid. And whatever UI changes that we declare inside of this class selector, we want it to describe the UI of our container, our div. Remember, this container is what's going to hold all of the photos, and we need to give it some specific flex properties in order to get the grid that we have right here. And so to actually get this class selector to describe the UI of our div, we have to reference it as a class name of our div. So you can reference class name as an attribute equal to this class right here. Make sure to copy and paste it to ensure that any UI changes are automatically reflected on this div. Now, if I go to my browser and in my developer tools, I go on elements. Right here is our photo grid, the div, our photo wall div. And remember, the div contains 3 figures. Right here are the figures inside of our div that we declared previously. Notice how thin the figures are. They're just really thin because we haven't really specified any padding for them just yet. And so all of our figures are inside of this container. Notice that here the figures extend to the container's width, which extends to the edges of our page. Whereas in the final version of the app, the container holding all of our pages, the div, it actually has a maximum width of 1000 pixels. We can check to see what the width is if we go to its developer tools, elements, and if you go to the div itself, the photo grid, it has a width of 1000 pixels. And so let's set that for our div. Inside of style sheet, give it a maximum width of 1000 pixels. So no matter how large our page is, the div is only going to occupy a certain amount of space. And so to prove that, you can simply go to your photo grid and simply see that it is indeed 1000 pixels, which makes the figures that it's enclosing smaller as well, according to its size. Now let's also go ahead and center our div by specifying margins of 0 for the vertical and auto for the horizontal. What we're saying is the vertical margins of our container, of our div, give them a thickness of 0 pixels. Leave them as is. As for the horizontal margins, we set auto. What auto does is it increases the left and right margins of a component, of an element I should say, until both left and right margins are equal, centering our elements exactly along the y-axis and therefore centering all of our figures. And notice the left and right margins have the same thickness, which ends up centering the div and therefore all the figures inside of it. Let's give our figures some color so that we can better observe what we're working with. Now, right now we're modifying the div. Let's start modifying the figures inside the div. So create a class selector of .figure, and whatever properties we declare inside of this class selector, we want it to describe the UI of the figures inside of our div. And once again, to accomplish this, simply reference the class name as an attribute of our figures. So give it a class name equal to the class selector that we just declared right here. All right. So once again, whatever UI changes we apply here will reflect our figures, all 3 of them. First, I'll start off by giving each figure a border. A border of 4 pixels wide. We'll eventually change that. A style of solid, which would simply show a straight solid line, and that line will have a color of black. As the app reruns, there are the figures. Much easier to see now. The figures at the moment are so thin that the borders on all 4 sides of the figure form a single straight line. We'll work on that in a bit by giving it padding, but for now, to build this basic grid system, we need to use flex. Our first goal will be to display these figures side by side in our container. To do that, we need to give our container a display of flex. Displaying the property of our parent element to flex, displaying the property of our container to flex, makes all of its children elements, all of the figures, it positions them horizontally next to each other, also making them flex items. So if you go here, clearly they are in rows on the same line. Instead of displaying them in rows, we can actually change the direction of how they are displayed by changing the flex direction. Oh, forgot my semicolon. By changing the flex direction equal to columns. And if we do that, clearly they align vertically in a column-wise direction. However, let's change it back to rows by simply removing the specification, since the default direction is in rows to begin with. And now you may have noticed that the figures are a bit too small. Well, if you go to the dev tools, they're actually 0 width and 0 height. What you're seeing here is just the border. It has no width or height whatsoever. We can change the width of our figures by assigning them a flex basis. Flex basis we'll use to specify the initial width of our flex item, and we'll give each figure a width for now of 60% of its container's width. All right. Now, if I go back here, this is more like 25% of its parent's width. Why is that? Well, the flex items, the figures, they are laid out in a single line, which causes them to overflow. If all these figures were 600 pixels, and if all of them were on the same line, there's no way they would all fit inside of a 1000 pixel photo grid, or a 1000 pixel div, I should say. And so we need to specify a property, flex wrap, inside of our container. And we'll give it a value of wrap. What this does is that it ensures that all of the flex items inside of the container can break into multiple 9s if needed, which preserves their initial width. And clearly, these now have a width of 600 pixels, 60% of this width. And now to make it look like more our final grid, I'm going to give it a very specific flex basis of a starting with Calc. Calc simply lets us perform calculations when specifying a value, and we want our initial width, our flex basis, to be 33% of our container's width minus 4 rems. And this looks a lot better. And so depending on the width of our photo grid, of our div, take 33% of that minus 4 rems. That's going to be the flex basis, the width of our figures. And now I'm a bit tired of our figures being so thin, so let's give them some padding of 2 rems. Padding 2 rem. This should look a lot better. And now instead of the solid black color for our border, let's use a very specific hex color of D3, 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 D3. This should look better. And remove the border from 4 pixels to 1, which would make it thinner. Next, we'll give all of our figures a flex grow property of 1. By giving all of our figures a flex grow property of 1, all elements within the same row of our flex container will share the same width, also taking up necessary space in our container. And finally, we'll give our figures some margins, which we can specify with margin such that it has a top margin with 0 pixel thickness and right bottom left margin thickness of 2 rems. 2 rem, 2 rem, and 2 rem. All right, this is looking much better. Now, I did promise that we would set up our entire photo wall component, but this video has gone on too long, so let's take a break and I'll see you in the next one.